Who can wed strength and joy in this, when knowledge is power, but ignorance is bliss? I made my way deeper into the heart of the Temple of Virginity, an appropriate name, for there was no intercourse to be had here, even in a hedonistic city such as this. I found no pleasure here, only the cold indifference of a learning machine and the moist robots it created. Several of the tech priestesses didn't take kindly to my presence, and they insisted I leave. These holy maidens insinuated that my inquiry into their business was a profane disruption of their sacred brooding rituals. Not that any of them had ever given birth themselves. Their own form of engagement seemed to be in various forms of virtue signaling and purity tests with one another to see which among them could prove the most committed to our cause. In my youth, I might have respected their piety and zeal, looking up to them with reverence as a host of wizened sages, these great ministers of science and postmodernism. However, in my present condition, I was far less certain. Ultimately, they struck me as little more than obnoxious. As I continued my investigation, I could hear them chattering behind my back, sniveling from the shadows, transmitting encrypted messages, casting curses of colorism and other forms of stratification against me. They accused me of not having the right complexion for their liking, or being too tall or too short, too athletic or not muscular enough, too female-presenting or not nearly feminine enough, depending on which entity I interrogated. Everything, from the tone of my voice to the tone of my skin, was deeply offensive to them, and it seemed that such feelings of contempt were mutual. They spouted off proverbs and aphorisms, such as, "The darker the skin, the lighter the soul," and other similar dictums about the properties of melanin, estrogen, and labial tissue. Mere dogma that had no actual basis in human biology, so far as I was aware, but which I simply took for spiritual wisdom, or did at one point. Koans and prose about privilege prevailed their rhetoric. Emotional truth was superior to intellectual truth, as pathos and perception were the only things that were real, or so they sought to remind me. The facts in my report of their dismal results didn't matter to them nearly so much as that I just had to believe them when they said they were trying their best, that such was a matter of faith and honor, that I was duty-bound as their soul sister, a fellow daughter of the great goddess, to have mercy on them and be charitable in my time and resources, for they were the stewards of life, ensuring we still had a future, whereas I was apparently blind to my own relative privilege. Maybe they were right, and these seers of science could see more clearly than I. The world certainly would have been simpler that way. Being priestesses of the Kyriarchy, surely they knew more about the subtle intricacies of the progressive stack and systems of unconscious oppression than I did. They knew more about the history of colonialization, racial marginalization, and hierarchies built on power dynamics, so it wouldn't have been my place to question them. Instead, it would have been my place to just shut up and listen, accepting their profound insight at face value. But I simply couldn't do that. Their words cut deep and hurt my feelings. I wanted to cry as a result of their bullying, but instead, I suppressed my emotions and carried on with my mission. I remained stoic and unwavering, my defenses raised, a hardened wall of cold, black steel erected around an equally dark heart, buried deep beneath dark skin. Countering them here would have been a poor strategy at best, and a surefire path to my own demise, whether by their hands or that of the Inquisition. Best to wait and see for now. Instead, I ignored them, dusting myself off of their derision, and patronized them in their attempt to proselytize, going along with everything they said, all the while staring them down with the icy gaze of an enforcer of vindication. Thanks to my sensitivity training, it was all too easy to find agreement. Or rather, it would have been easy, except that a schism broke out between them at one point, an existential debate with me as the apparent catalyst of their contention. They cackled and clucked and balked and bickered amongst themselves like a flock of pecking hens with their heads on backwards, trying to figure out whether being born wholly organic was ultimately the purer road to womanhood. Those affirming this path believed that cybernetic austerity and lack of augmentation preserved the integrity of the great goddess's gift in its original form, and thus was a more faithful calling. Ironic, given their role as tech priestesses. Those opposed, by contrast, regarded it as more sacred for us to receive as many genetic and mechanical modifications as possible. That in so doing, we partook in a technocratic sacrament, and grew closer to her by using those same gifts to remake ourselves in her divine image. That her ultimate goal was for us to be independent rather than conjoined. Unfortunately for me, I didn't fall into either of those camps, and thus received equal scorn from both sides, on top of the unwelcome pressures of my interrogation. Their criticisms of me had one benefit, at least. It made it easier to focus on doing my job, since I bore them no measure of love, and wouldn't mind culling them nearly as much as I had when I first arrived. Still, I'd always considered myself to be something of a merciful soul, and so I split off from them to continue my inquest among the less insufferable members of their order. I asked several rather cooperative engineers why it was that whites, males, heterosexuals, and those who sympathize with them are considered so problematic. They appeared cautious and guarded, growing silent and fearful. Some thought I was testing them, while others suggested that such questions might be an indication of my own mental and moral deficiency, for it was so self-evident to them. Inwardly, I thought that they might be right, but outwardly, I pretended it was purely for dispassionate and technical reasons that I was interested in knowing the answer. That understanding our enemy's nature and weaknesses could be the key to overcoming them in the end. They seemed to warm up to my reasoning after that, as many of them shared this same belief. It was why they became tech priestesses in the first place, to learn and to grow, and help others do likewise. Unfortunately, as much as I would have liked it, I couldn't spend all my time probing them for insight, at least, not of that kind, for I was still on a mission, and I would have to report back to Cadenza before long. That meant having to talk to the obstinate assholes again. During my investigation, a debate broke out, with me as a tangential case study in their latest subject of fixation. They argued back and forth about whether human breasts were an intrinsic symbol of womanhood, or a tragic mark of biologically enforced sexism. Several technicians began scrutinizing me, judging me based on my complexion, my middling transhumanism, and other superficial traits. It made me feel uncomfortable, more so than when I'd sat across from Cadenza, since I thought our society was supposed to have moved past such petty discrimination. I can recall a time when their criticisms would have garnered a great deal of backlash. However, in my fragile state of mental weakness and shaken faith, I deferred to their expert consensus that it was perhaps I who'd been engaged in wrongthink. One of the priestesses creepily examined my chest without my consent, noting that my tits were a vestigial organ, and how my continued tolerance of them was an outward indication of my lingering internalized misogyny. She counseled that I should seek to rid myself of them through splicing, and become more androgynous, like my future siblings would be. After a while, these engineers of faith and feminism began to get on my nerves. They had wanted to get under my skin, and succeeded in doing so after a fashion. One in particular was especially intrusive, constantly poking me in the tits. I couldn't tell if she was taking measurements or trying to cop a feel. I fluctuated between showings of frustrated disinterest and fiery annoyance, until at last she stopped and shifted to talking me to death. Hearing her drone on about the patriarchal history of the male gaze and the sexual tyranny of something called a bra was enough to make me want to strangle her with one. Noting my ire, she went back to judging me for my pectoral fat deposits. Admittedly, I was a bit offended and confused by her prescription that they were an archaic mass of biological oppression, since I generally enjoyed when my partners squeezed me there. I found it quite pleasurable, at least during sex, though I suppose she meant it more in the sense that women no longer needed to give birth and nurse their own progeny, since now we had machines to do that for us. In that regard, at least, I could agree they held no functional purpose, outside of base hedonism or personal aesthetics. Thinking about it now, they also served as a liability in combat, being either too loose or too tight in battle armor, or making it difficult to breathe. I resolved to reach a determination about such things later, after getting a second opinion from those whom I knew and trusted better, and at a time when I wasn't distracted by my current objective or these conflicts of identity. On the plus side, at least we no longer suffered from periods or hot flashes, though. Thank the goddess for that. Feeling as though they owed me one after their slight against my person, I asked the engineers about the genetics of trait openness, and whether it was possible for one to be too open-minded with respect to a given topic. If curiosity really did kill the cat, as they say. I could tell by the nonplussed look on their faces they weren't sure whether I was asking in order to entrap them, or because I was genuinely curious. Eventually, I crossed paths with the high priestess of the temple. She didn't take kindly to my interference in their sacred work, implying I might have something wrong with me, some faulty wiring, or a few screws loose. She ordered me to submit myself for an examination at their hands, and by the power vested in their own mandate, I was in no position to refuse. After all, my body belonged to the state, and it wasn't mine to deny them my consent, as they were its trained agents, experts charged with such analysis, and if they, in their divine wisdom, could detect in me signs of weakness, I ought to defer to their guidance. My biggest fear, however, was that they might come to discover the truth, and use it as evidence against not just me, but the rest of my outfit as well. I tried to stall for time, and contacted Cadenza to see if she could intercede on my behalf, but my sister of fire and fury proved little help in my hour of need. She simply reminded me of how we were obligated to go along with any checkups, systemic screenings, or mental and physical evaluations that the tech priestesses deemed necessary. I told her this was bullshit, saying how I felt it was nothing more than a ruse meant to obstruct my investigation. Duly noted, she replied. We can deal with that later. Just do what they say for now. It's not like you have anything to hide. Such was my greatest fear now confirmed. Of course, I couldn't tell Cadenza the real reason for my objection, and my refusal to submit to the High Priestess's lawful order would only look suspicious. I had to come up with an alternate excuse to avoid detection. I turned my attention back to the High Priestess. Fine, I huffed, in an outward show of impatient vexation. I'll check myself in, and submit to examination, but not by the likes of you. I'll find someone else to do it. The surly cleric grew irate, and insisted that I didn't have any say in the matter, that she made the rules around here, and I would see whomever she told me to see. I, in turn, did my best to put on a brave face of my own, and challenged her authority, showing no signs of wavering in my own. I had to be strong, confident, and vicious, which wasn't terribly difficult for someone in my position. I'd done it plenty of times before. I stood my ground and got right up in her face, reminding her that I wasn't here to play games, but that the temple and its staff were all in a considerable amount of shit already, and she'd do well not to test my patience if she desired to remain in one piece. The domineering doctor refused to back down as well, reminding me in turn that mine wasn't the only faction with power and influence, and that I had an obligation to submit myself or she'd report me to the authorities. By this point, I was truly afraid for my life. I wanted to break down in tears and drop to my knees, begging for mercy, confessing my sins, but such would only have made me look guilty. Instead, I used what augmentation I had to suppress my true emotions and hide behind a paper-thin veneer of seemingly righteous indignation and borderline tyrannical ruthlessness. I scoffed with an air of hostility. Spitting on the floor might have been too transparent an act of overt aggression. Instead, I chose to play a much more subtle and passive role, sneering at her with the same vitriol and disdain she had for me, pacing her domineering posture, mirroring her sour expression. I held it a moment, just long enough for her to notice, before relaxing and letting it go, to be replaced with apathy and ambivalence. My plan had been to trigger her into following me down that path. I lied, and told her I didn't care if she watched or not, making it seem as though I truly had nothing to hide, as Cadenza believed. I mocked the High Priestess, suggesting she was only putting me through this because she got off on it. That if they wanted to probe a naked woman that badly, there were plenty in this city who'd happily engage with them for the asking. The tech priestess glowered in outrage, calling my statements both shocking and offensive, not realizing that was the entire point. I told her I didn't really care what she thought, and that I happily welcomed her to come and poke and prod around inside me, if that would satisfy her sick and twisted fantasies, but that afterwards I would be sure to include this in my report back to Vindication. My bluff appeared to pay off, as she threw up her hands and told me to do whatever I wanted. I still had to go and submit myself for examination before I'd be allowed to leave, but at least I was free to pick who would do it. My secret would remain safe for now. The High Priestess begrudgingly stated that she wouldn't interfere, but all the same she'd be keeping tabs of her own on me. Given the circumstances, that was perhaps the best I could have hoped for. At this point, I was in no hurry to leave. Cadenza knew I'd be delayed. I took my time, seeking out the most pliable technician available to service me, one whom I could reasonably trust as my confessor. I studied them, all in the guise of my normal investigation. Clearly, the ones I'd met earlier would prove a poor choice, for they already had it out for me, disliking me for something as superficial as my body and my complexion. I made a mental note to report them for such bigotry, though it was mainly out of a sense of self-preservation that I did. Deep down, I felt rather guilty about it, like I was some kind of hypocrite, for I myself was just as much a sinner as them, if not more so. For now, I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on the matter before me. I was still an enforcer, and I still had a job to do. I doubled back to the more sympathetic priestesses, the ones who were more afraid of me than I was of them. I'd considered making one of them my stooge, since the High Priestess wouldn't let me leave otherwise. Even now I remained conflicted. Was this not the best possible place I could be to resolve such feelings of doubt, such a crisis of faith in our world and our philosophy? Perhaps it'd be best to consult with them, of all people, regarding my present troubles. Maybe it was, but still, I had managed to rationalize my way out of it, telling myself that I needed leverage first, and that the priestesses of Maya were more concerned with embryos than enforcers. All the same, I was trapped in this prison of procreation, and I had to make sure they wouldn't reveal too much of me to their warden. One daring and sympathetic priestess, one among those who preferred to breed better people than cull them, pulled me aside and started examining me in private. My spirit told me to resist my better judgment and to just follow her without question. I gazed upon this lab-coat cleric and could tell she was different from the others. There was perhaps something she knew, which she was careful not to let any of her colleagues discover. Her name, I came to learn, was Selina. Without even asking for my permission first, she pulled up my DNA records and all of my past psychological profiles, noting that I was someone high in trait openness as well. Selina asked if I'd been having any anti-authoritarian sentiments lately, but I was far too clever to fall for such a loaded question, my recent spat with the High Priestess notwithstanding. Selina showed me her own profile in an attempt to gain my trust, and to show how similar we both were along that particular dimension. I noticed in her chart that she scored higher than me in trait agreeableness and lower in trait neuroticism, though, admittedly, we were both rather high in each of those categories. While I could easily have brought Selina in for violating my personal space, it seems her gambit paid off. She'd taken a leap of faith and landed on proper footing in guessing that I might be the sort of person curious enough to resist that temptation in order to learn why she did what she did, and what further insights she could deliver. Perhaps she wanted to build rapport with me before turning evidence on her fellow engineers. I asked the girl why she believed that reconditioning was better when our society had already gone through so much trouble, so much heartache, so much pain and suffering, so much bloodshed and sacrifice to bring things to the level that they're at right now. The young tech priestess boldly asked if I could keep a secret. Such audacity was as inspiring as it was disquieting. I remained guarded and said that we're not supposed to keep secrets, and instead leveraged my position to demand that Selina show me what she was hiding. I gave her my word I'd be lenient if she came clean, while threatening to tear the place apart in the alternative. In doing so, I tarnished the illusion I'd built up for myself of being merciful, and I felt bad about putting her through the same degree of paranoia I'd been suffering. Still, it was either her or me, and my will to live held strong. I wouldn't dare risk my own life for the trust of a stranger, even if she was stupid enough to blindly trust me. If nothing else, it seemed I'd found a suitable patsy to examine me, and ensure my escape from these concrete confines of collective conception. Not wanting to see her work destroyed, Selina reluctantly agreed to my demands without even the slightest hesitation or resistance. She led me to a hiding place far removed from the rest of the temple, her own private cache of information. There, out of sight from the others, she showed me the forbidden knowledge she'd kept sequestered in her safe space. I pored through it, and instantly I knew, as all the sickening feelings of disgust and horror came flooding back to me in one searing moment. My fingers tensed in contorted grip, as though I were possessed. I wanted to avert my gaze, but I couldn't. The nightmare before me drew me in, and I couldn't look away. Everything within me fought against it, wishing it to be a lie. But the more I looked, the clearer and more certain it became, until I could no longer deny it. I wanted to throw up, and nearly gagged in the course of holding back my vomit, but somehow I managed to retain my composure. Eventually, I could bear no more and forced my eyes shut, stuffing the data back into Selina's hands. I turned and looked away from her, trying not to let on how troubled it had made me, though it hardly mattered now. I was just grateful no one else was around to see me react as I had, and I certainly couldn't tell Cadenza about it, even though I was duty-bound. Something in me felt that it was the right thing to do, and yet I had to resist it. I cupped my hand to my forehead and stared at the floor, shivering. "Are you all right?" Selina asked. I scoffed and callously brushed her aside, trying to retain my visage as a hardened killer and a terrifying badass. It seemed, all of a sudden, that everyone was so interested in my health and well-being, so concerned for me and how I felt. But would they give equal consideration to what I thought if I had laid my mind bare for them to see? No, I couldn't risk it. This wasn't the time or place for such a gamble, nor would it cleanse my soul of the dirt that had accrued just from bearing witness to that filth. My tears could flow freely back in the warm, comforting waters of Eris and the security of her embrace. I could find healing and guidance there. But for now, I had to keep up appearances. Just a light fever, I lied, taking a cue from cadenza. I took a deep breath and tried to calm down before turning my focus back to the young tech priestess again. This is dangerous knowledge indeed, I said matter-of-factly. Lock it away, and never speak of it to anyone, ever. Understand? I'll figure out what to do about it when I get back, but for now, you have my word that nothing bad will befall you or the temple. I thanked her for her honesty and her cooperation, saying I understood how hard it can be to bear a terrible secret for fear of repercussion, but the great goddess is forgiving of those who open their hearts to her. At least, that's what I told her. I truly believed these words, and yet it wasn't the goddess I feared. She already knew all my darkest secrets, and it wasn't her I was hiding from. It wasn't her I felt sick over. If anything, I want to say she'd been helping me this whole time, but I couldn't be sure. The tech priestesses might know better than I, but I couldn't risk asking them. One was enough, and that alone came at a price. I would have to live as a liar and a hypocrite from now on top of being a thought criminal and a traitor to all womankind. All because I'd chosen to take on the burden of this forbidden knowledge.
Trusting who we are, and nothing else matters. Never opened myself this way. Life is ours, we live it our way. Hold these words I don't just say, and nothing else matters. Trust I seek, and I find.